From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Tell me.
Bend my knees.
Say your name.
Oh, ready?
I'm ready.
Spell my name?
No, say it. Say your name. Where were you born? When?
I was born in Caryville, Florida. My name is Robert, middle initial L for Lee, and Carter. I think the name Robert is a name that's commonly, I don't think I have to spell that. Lee is L-E-E, and Carter is a common name that's spelled C-A-R-T-E-R. So I think I have a common name that's not unusual.
Wonderful. Okay.
I was not, I hope, named after the Confederate General, Robert Lee, but I may have been at the time because I came from the South, and during that period, the Southern generals and stuff like that were considered heroic by black people, but I don't know.
Okay, Pat, whenever you're ready.
We're good to go?
Yes, we're
Do room
recording.
sound?
Okay, and then where should he look?
Sound?
Where should he look? Should he look at you all? I
Look
mean,
at you.
look at me. Will
Yes.
that pick up well on the camera? Okay.
You're
Did
not.
you pick it all up?
Yeah,
You
no,
got it,
that was a
yes.
test, so we're ready to go.
Okay,
And you can look at me, they say.
look at you.
Yeah, as long as that works.
Sure. You have something you want to make an adjustment? Okay, we're ready.
Okay. Okay. Judge Carter, you're a child of the Great Migration. Tell us about where and when you were born and how you came to come north.
I was born in Caryville, Florida, and when I was very young, after my mother birthed me, I was a part of the migration of families out of the Deep South to the North, and that great migration. My family was born free. We were, I think, maybe about 60 years after the Civil War, and so we were a free blacks coming out of the South in the Great Migration.
And what year was that?
What?
What year were you born?
I was born in 1917, and in Caryville, I said earlier, in Caryville, Florida.
And where did your family move to? Your father was already up north.
My father had, my mother was in Florida birthing me, and I think that he was, or they were, part of the migrant agricultural family, but because of the war, he apparently had some charisma, or was a man who was just not a peon, but he had some intelligence. They sent him north, and he was working in a factory. And after my mother birthed me, she joined him and the rest of the family in Newark.
Newark. What are your earliest memories about growing up in Newark?
Well, my father died when I was a year old, and my mother had no special education. She was not an ignorant woman. She had some schooling, but she did not have enough schooling to get a job other than as a washing clothes for white people. And that she did to keep bread on the table for us. And I lived with her by present standards in poverty until I was 12. When I was 12 years old, my older sister married. She was a woman who sewed and made clothes. And she married this man who owned a bar in Linden, New Jersey. And that was sort of like coming out of poverty. She insisted that he remain, that all the family lived together, and so she lived with him, and the family all together, and that enabled us to get better housing, and every time we sort of moved, it was to improve our living conditions. After I was 12 years old, I became, for the first time, with her marriage, I was able to have a bathroom to myself, an indoor toilet, an indoor bath. Until that time, I had to use outhouses with other people. I remember that with such distaste. And fortunately, it was sort of, her marrying this man was sort of like the period when in the white fairy tale, when this poor girl marries this rich man. And it was similar to that because it opened the door to me to mainstream prerogatives. I had never been in indoor toilets and stuff like that. All of what I learned about the difference between the poor and the rich, for example, is that poor people never or rarely learn what they need to know. They live, middle-class people can live on the streets and stuff like that. But when it comes time but they need to know something, they know where to get it. Mm-hmm. And second thing between the poor and the rich is that the poor people act out their life on the streets. Middle-class people do the same thing, but behind doors. And they do not, they have porches and stuff, and they do not have to live their life on the street. I saw, when I was in a Boyden Street, which was once one of the worst slums in a ghetto, and it has been rehabilitated, or what do you call it? It's now the city of Newark has redone Boyden Street. It was one of the worst slums, and they rejuvenated, or whatever that you call they're doing. So,
Well, education. You wrote in your memoir that your desire for education early on inspired you. Schooling and education, what opened you up to that in the way that you went ahead and succeeded so well?
I was not skillful with my hands, and I knew that somehow I was going to find a way into the mainstream and get an education and find my way there. And what I recognized was the only way I could do that was to get an education. I was considered smart, and I had skipped in school and stuff like that. And that was an advantage to me. And also I read a lot, undisciplined reading, but at the same time, it exposed me to a lot of ideas and stuff. And I knew somehow I had to be in the mainstream, find my way to the mainstream, or else I would not survive. And so I recognized that. And I spent a lot of time in the library, at a public library close by. Unfortunately, my reading was undisciplined. I like to read novels and history, historic novels, and stuff. And from time to time, some real hard, disciplined reading I would do. But for the most part, it was not the kind of hard-nosed reading that forms a brilliant mind. But anyway, any kind of reading helps.
What were schools like in Newark and then in East Orange?
What?
What were the schools like? I mean,
What was Newark like?
Were they integrated?
No, Newark was, when I was in Newark, until I was 12 years old, that was where we were in poverty. And the people from the South, the migrations from the South would come on. My sisters were at the age of puberty, and my mother was very worried that the guys would after them, and that they would, be impregnated early on, and she wanted desperately to get out of there. when my sister Mamie married, this guy had this bar and grill. She was able to satisfy that because the guys would be on the street after my sisters, who at that time were, 16 and so, and she was certain that they might be impregnated and stuff, and she was very worried about that. And it, of course, showed a double standard because I had more freedom. She was not worried about me impregnating anybody, but she should have been that concerned, but she was not.
When did you become aware of race?
I think early on, when I was in maybe the 6th grade or so, we had two girls in the class were friends, white girl and a black girl. And I remember this to this day. The white girl had bangs, and she was all front hair black. The black girl had braids, and she wouldn't throw her hair back, but she tried to. They were very, very close friends. And at one point, the black girl and the white girl had an argument. And the white girl went to the teacher and complained. And the teacher had no sympathy for her. She told her, you should stay with your own kind. And that showed me how prejudice affects itself. But this was in the Newark school, and even though this teacher said that to this white girl, had no sympathy for her, in Newark, they sort of stayed back and allowed things to play out. While when I was in East Orange school, they were adverse to any black-white intercourse. They didn't like that at all, and they intervened. And what that showed me is the very faces of prejudice. I'm sure that my teachers in East Orange, now in Newark, were as concerned about and as prejudiced as the teachers in East Orange were, proved to be. But they stood back and let things play out. And so what that showed me is how white prejudice has various forms. The East Orange people intervened and wanted segregation to be imposed. They couldn't do it by law anymore, but they wanted it imposed. The other people, the teachers in Newark, were not that, they were as concerned, I guess, but they didn't interfere.
You had very different experience, you write about in your book, at Barrington High School, where you went for 2 years, and then you went to East Orange High School in your 3rd year of high school. Could you talk about, I think a good example that you write about is what happened around the swimming pool. how it was organized, how it changed, and what your role was in that.
Well, I don't know. I don't remember what grade I was in now,
It doesn't matter.
but at one point, what would happen in gym classes, was that we had gym maybe 3 or 4 times a week, and we would play basketball, or they would say some calisthenics and basketball, and then part of the class, the white kids would go down to the pool and either swim or learn to swim. And blacks were not allowed to use the pool except on alternate weekends when the sexes, or the black women or girls, would use the pool after class, and then the pool was clean. And then on the other weekend, the black boys would use the pool, and then the pool was then cleaned out. And there was a ruling from the Supreme Court of New Jersey that all the facilities could not be segregated. That all the school facilities had to be open to all people. And armed with that knowledge, I decided I was going to use the pool. I don't know how I learned it. I must have read it in the newspaper. And what made the story so absurd, huh?
Tell what you did. Tell you went the only one.
I read about it, and what made it so absurd was that I couldn't swim, and I would go to the pool every day. That was gym class when the white boys went down. What that meant that the white boys stayed out of the pool. Nobody was in the pool but me. And I couldn't swim. I was scared to death, even a few feet of water, because I didn't know. And I was in the pool alone during the class. I couldn't get any of the other blacks to join me. And after that semester, I was threatened by the teacher. They were going to expel me and stuff, and I refused to run. They pleaded with me to not do this, to stay on the floor like the others. But my feeling was that I was entitled to use that pool, and that it was my right to use it. If I had been white, that time, even if I couldn't swim, was not the issue. They would be teaching me to swim. They were teaching white kids who couldn't swim. That was the time they were taught them to swim. So it was a very stressful time for me. And the net result was that instead of allowing everybody to use the pool and opening it, they closed it. And it was a bad feature for the school, East Orange, because it had one of the best swimming teams in the city. It was winning a lot of tournaments and stuff like that. But it decided that instead of opening the pool to everybody, that it would close it. And that showed me the great cost to whites of segregations. They pay a price for it.
Mm-hmm.
So
You enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania when you were 16. How did you come to go to Lincoln University?
well, I skipped a lot of classes. I was considered very bright, and I was a very good test taker. So I was thought I would finish by test before anybody else and leave the class. Now I don't, I was considered brilliant, but and I guess I can accept that. But it seems to me that that's a gift too, being able to learn to take tests and that does not necessarily mean intellectual gifts, but at the time, because I was so good at it, I was considered intellectually gifted, and I'll accept that. No point my fighting that.
What was Lincoln like? Lincoln University. What was it like to be a student at Lincoln University?
Lincoln University was a great experience for me. I really had such a wonderful time there. It was isolated and off the hard-beaten path, and we spent a lot of time together, my friends and I, and played while I was not interested at that time in the hard sciences. What I was interested in was the social sciences, and I was while I was in the laboratories and so forth, I'd be looking out, wanting to be on the campus, playing ball and all this stuff. It was really one of the very great times of my life. I was so, had friends and people there because we were so isolated. And
it was the first time you were in a predominantly black educational environment.
Yeah.
Did that have something to do with it?
yeah, we were. What I learned, however, was that it was not the school. It was a time when I had all my friends and people there, and I went back sometime later, but the spell was gone.
How did your time at Lincoln prepare you for civil rights activism, do you think?
When we were, Lincoln was an all-male school, and its professors were former professors retired from Princeton. And the head of the provost or whatever it is of Lincoln was a Princeton graduate. And they never, the Lincoln men were at that time very boorish, would get drunk and tear things down and so forth. And there was no effort to curb this. And when we came along, we thought that they were being paternalistic, that the faculty was, that they sort of condoned this as a way that had to be accepted because blacks were not able to control themselves. So my generation of school felt that we should be able to control ourselves. We didn't have to be breaking up things and stuff like that. And we were young men, supposed to be educated, and so we should not tolerate this boorish behavior that was being exhibited by and accepted. So we started agitating for black faculty, for more blacks on the faculty. There was only one professor of English, black, on the faculty. All the rest of the people were white. And we began to agitate for that. And I think, and we was on the debating, I was on the debating team, and we had debates with the small colleges like Haverford and not the Ivy League schools and colleges, but just below that. And I think what that did for me was to enable me to not fear competing with whites. That gave me some courage and understanding that I would compete with white people, which is one of the problems at that time that blacks as a whole had, because they were stereotypes, were worried about being able to compete with white people. But that was a good time in my life that I learned not to, and that was helpful.
That's important. How did you come to choose to go to Howard Law School?
How did I come?
From Lincoln, you went to Howard. What?
I went to Howard Law School on a scholarship. One of the people was recruited, and I had never thought I could be a good lawyer because of my voice. I don't have a good voice. And I thought a good lawyer had to have a big voice and could claim and stuff. But I found that you didn't have to do that to be a decent lawyer. What you had to do was to be able to know the facts and to be able to be conversant with all the facts and the law. And my idol was William Hastie, who was the dean of Howard Law School. He didn't have a good voice, but he was very, very smart and knew all the facts. And I came to realize that when I had a case, that what I had to do was to know all the facts, be conversant with all the facts, so that I could answer all the questions, and that I didn't have to declaim. And that helped me to become aware that I could be a good civil rights lawyer.
Okay. And tell, what was it like to be a law student at Howard University? You enrolled in 1937 in the fall.
Well, it was, at the time, Howard was on a special mission. The Charles Houston had a program that we were going to fight segregation. It's the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. And we were going to fight it by making all the institutions, the state institutions, that offered courses for whites and not for blacks, to offer duplicate courses for blacks, or establish separate schools for blacks. And we knew that they couldn't do that. And finally what happened was that as we fought to make them offer these separate courses, we realized that they could not pay for it. And so they began to, in the graduate school, they began to accept blacks without segregation. Or they would do as they did in my first case I argued before the Supreme Court. The separate but equal doctrine, in this case McLaurin, they tried to provide the separate but equal doctrine. The McLaurin was in the same class, in the same faculty. All his segregation was that he was required to sit in a special seat, and he was required to eat at a separate table, and he had maybe a rope around him, but this was, they considered really separate but equal. And this was the beginning of the precursor to Brown.
Yes, that's right.
And
Because you won that case.
yeah,
That was in
that was my
1950.
first case.
Right.
And the Supreme Court held that the separation deprived him of the ability to learn his profession. And that a separate school, that the separation itself deprived him of the ability to learn.
But let's go back to Howard just for a little bit, because that's down the road a
Back
bit.
where?
Back to Howard when you were a student there.
Howard?
Because while you were a student, you mentioned Charles Houston. You mentioned Charles Houston, and while you were a student at Howard, he tried the first major case that would be part of the cases leading to Brown, the Gaines case. And you were there to see that.
Yeah.
And also, he came to Howard the day before for moot court.
Yeah.
Could you tell that story about moot court and then going to the Supreme Court and watching him try that case?
Well, my first time I was in the Supreme Court building, I heard his argument before the Supreme Court in the Gaines case. This guy, Missouri Expo Gaines, was seeking equal educational opportunity. And they had a school for Gaines, they had the school in Gaines for blacks and no school for whites, as I recall. No school for
Break. Can we take a break?
Oh, okay, that's what we were all discussing.
what's up?
Challenged sending the students out.
Where they're going.
Are you ready?
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Ready? Okay.
Okay.
We're rolling.
Okay, so if you want to start by University of Missouri, the Gaines case at the Supreme Court.
I think the Gaines case was the first argument that I had witnessed in the United States Supreme Court. And there were two things about the cases I recall that became a tradition. The day before the argument, we had an argument at the school, at the law school. And in the course of the argument, Charles Houston argued the case. One of the justices asked Mr. Houston a question that one of the students in the pre-game, the argument before us, had queried, had asked. And that made all the Supreme Court arguments brought by on the NAACP auspices and Legal Defense Fund, those arguments were made to the Howard Law School the day before they were argued by the Supreme Court. And that became a tradition for a long time. And that was, we got a lot of run with that and heard, people, Houston, and all Thurgood and I, we'd always argue these cases before, the night before, and that was not.
So how was Houston in the Supreme Court? What was it like seeing Houston argue the Gaines case in the Supreme Court and being there?
Well, I was always sort of nervous at first, and then I would get involved in the argument, and I'd lose it, but I would.
No, but watching Houston argue the Gaines case, what
Oh.
happens in that instance?
Houston argued the Gaines case, and in the course of his argument, when the case was called, Justice McReynolds turned his back on Houston throughout his argument. And the story goes, it's probably not true, that after the case was over, that Justice McReynolds had his barber was doing his hair, and he said that I just heard the nigger, Houston, argue a case in the Supreme Court. And so the barber turned to him, this is the story, and said that Mr. Houston, we consider him one of the great people, and we think he is capable and qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. And if he did, we know that he would represent all the people and not just a few. The story goes that as he told that McReynolds, began stomping in his chair. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I hope it was.
That's a great story. That's great. Any just quick impressions of Charles Houston? Could you describe impressions of Houston that you had? Impressions of Charles Houston as a person. Anything stand out to you?
Impressions
of Charles Houston.
He was a formidable guy. I didn't know him very well. Mm-hmm. And I only heard him argue a few cases or one or two cases, because he, I think, had money problems, and yet he could not stay with the NAACP. Mm-hmm. He turned that job over to Thurgood, mm-hmm. because he had to get a child, a son, I think, and he had to go in the practice of law to make some money. Mm-hmm. So I was not.
Okay.
I was not. Hasty was my icon. I didn't know Houston too well.
He was your mentor. The other big event that happened during your years at Howard Law School was on Easter Sunday in 1939, when you were among the group that heard Marian Anderson. And you had a job that day to do. You were working in a restaurant, and you made a decision.
Well, I had a scholarship to the law school, but I also had a part-time job first as a busboy and then as a waiter to make some extra money. And also to help me when I went to my school. And so I waited tables. And the Marian Anderson concert, Eleanor, they refused to allow her, the Daughters of the American Revolution, refused to allow her to sing Constitution Hall. So Mrs. Roosevelt arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. And that day, it was a day that I asked to be off, but I was refused, of course. And I hoped that I wasn't going to be a waiter for life. And I knew that wasn't. So I just went to the concert, and it was memorable. It was really, everybody was half in tears, and I cried, and of course I cry easily. And she sang beautifully. It was historic. When I got back to the hotel, the dining room was in chaos. So it got straightened out. And after the evening meal was over, I was fired as I was expected to be. It was restored, so they fired me. And I was not unprepared for that. But what happened after I was fired was that I got a full scholarship to work in the library part-time. And so I worked in the library, did my lessons and stuff like that, and was worked, got money for that, and so the whole thing was a boost for me.
Could you describe a little bit more that being in that crowd? What was so moving about being at the Lincoln Memorial? What did it look like?
Well, we all knew that history was being made, and she was in great voice, and here this black woman was at the Lincoln Memorial singing, how desegregated the Daughters of the American Revolution. She had desegregated Constitutional Hall. And she had desegregated, they had kept the segregation of Constitutional Hall, but after that they were out of the picture, because that was why Mrs. Roosevelt got Marian Anderson to sing at Lincoln Memorial.
And the crowd was integrated? It was all...
Oh, yeah. There was a big, big crowd, as I recall. Everybody was in tears. At least I was crying, because we thought history was being made. This woman was such great voice and the first black woman to sing before this large integrated crowd. It was a huge gathering, and it was a historic day.
Great. Okay. When you graduated from Howard, you went off to Columbia on a scholarship. What were your plans leaving Howard Law School? How did you see your future? And why did you go to Columbia?
Well, I had not really focused on anything. I had worked at the NAACP, and I thought that I had explored it to the limits, and there was nothing else
Well, let's back up, because you didn't go to the NAACP until after the war.
huh?
You didn't go to the NAACP until after World War II. You went to Columbia on the Rosenwald Fellowship?
Oh, I was on a scholarship. Working on First Amendment issues. And my thesis that I was working on was the extent to which the right to First Amendment's right were essential to a democratic process. And it got me very excited about it. And during that time when my thesis, when I decided I was going to work on this, I had two avenues. I could work full-time on that issue and take a few classes, and I would be able to get my doctorate, because I was working on a doctorate of jurisprudence. I could get my doctorate after a year's residence, and I had 5 years to complete it. I could complete part of my dissertation, or I could take a whole lot of courses and get my doctorate, my master's in law that way. The more difficult route was to write part of my thesis, and I was advised by the faculty to take the courses, that the other way was more difficult. And that annoyed me. And so I decided that I was going to work on my thesis and try to finish it and have it accepted. And I chose incorrectly my advisor. I chose Noel Dowling, who in my class in the law school, he had read the text, and he was what shall I say? He was one of these technicians who felt that the Supreme Court differences were based upon this slight change and a little change in this, that, not on the social scene outside the court. And I thought that was nonsense. But I also felt that I learned from him that in arguing before the court, it did sometimes did you good to make these little distinctions, because the court would find a way to rule for you without making an overwhelming ruling. And that I learned, although my feeling was that the Supreme Court's changes followed the vote, and that political change was reflected in the Supreme Court's rulings. But in the process of getting a case, a ruling with a case, it was good to be able to argue these little distinctions, because it helped the court, I realized, make a ruling without admitting that it was politically affected. And so I learned a lot from them.
Okay, hold on, hold your next question, because I need to put a new tape in.
Okay. The next one, we're going to get to World War II, and I'll just ask you, how did World War II impact your life? And that's a good question, don't you think? And start out by saying World War II, because they're not going to have my questions in your tape. They're just going to have you talking. So either repeat the question or just say World War. I think the point to emphasize, he's not taping right now. Start with how you didn't resist the draft. You went in at the. Describe how you entered the Army Air Force and your involvement in World War II, its impact on you. Just pick up where you were just now.
Now?
Yeah, pick up in the summer of 1941. You did not resist the draft.
Well, I was at the time I had thought that I had gone as far as I could go in fighting segregation. I thought that there was nothing else to do, that I had exhausted all the avenues of fighting segregation, and I was restless, and here I was also of some age, and I didn't feel comfortable or that I had anywhere in my career. I was worried about what I could do with my career. And so I didn't resist the draft. I thought that if I got in the Army, it would improve my health and all that sort of thing, which it did, as a matter of fact. And when World War II broke out, Pearl Harbor and so forth, I was in the Army. And it came at a time when the NAACP was arguing and fighting for blacks to become a part of the Army, not be just as servants. And up to that point, they had not had these black people. There were a few black units, all black units, but they hadn't had all these blacks to be integrated into the Army. And it presented a problem to them because they hadn't had a corps of black men trained for anything. They were all the long-time people who had been in there, in the Army, were people who were not well-educated people. They had operated as servants to white men, to white officers, and these men, like they were staff sergeants and so forth, but these were the only blacks who had any standing and experience, and so these blacks became the people that they utilized as to take in and train and discipline all these new blacks that were coming in. The NAACP and other people were very concerned about that, and the agitation for them to train black people, to these black recruits, to give them opportunities to become officers and so forth. And it was in that setting that I became a part of the Army. Army Air Corps was called at the time. We had no training, had this sergeant who was ignorant, who was a staff sergeant, and what we did, for the most part, what they had us doing for the most part, was clearing bush. We went to Augusta, Georgia, and we were clearing trees and cutting down trees and clearing them. And I knew that that wasn't for me. And so I wasn't a lawyer at the time. I had a lot of legal education, but I hadn't passed the bar. But that didn't mean anything. The staff sergeant who was now in charge of these black recruits in Augusta and so forth was an ignorant, long-time Army man. He had a couple of wives, had all kinds of problems, and so I became his lawyer, and I represented him and advised him about his domestic problem. And as a result, I was given, I was not in that workforce, clearing bush. I was in his office as his advisor on various aspects. And then I had a problem. How about that, Papa? With Hayes?
Yeah, well, I think the detail is interesting, but really what's so important is your experience, how your experience in the Army sets you on the course of your life as a civil rights lawyer. I mean, the kind of racism you experienced, you just said before off tape that it was devastating.
Well, what I knew at the time that I was not going to spend my time cleaning brush and that sort of stuff, that I had to find a way out of that. And so I became this man's personal lawyer and represented him. And after the agitation of the, blacks to open the Army for black recruits to be able to become officers and so forth, that agitation opened the way for me to get to officer candidate school. And I became a member of the Quartermaster Corps. And the Army was then, as I recall, segregated. But we had, within the Army, it was segregated, but within the Army, we had our exercises and so forth. We worked in tents, and as I recall, there were maybe 10 blocks, and we were all in a tent together. But then we took classes and drills and stuff after Truman, a call for integration. No?
No, that's 48. You leave the Army in 44.
Okay. Well,
here's what you write. I want you to react to this.
I was in the Army.
You said, it was the Army experience that made a militant of me.
I was in the Army, and what bothered me at the time about the Army, now recall, was that segregation was so much a part of it that whites, enlisted men, had no respect for black officers, and they wouldn't salute and so forth. And I brought an action against several of them, for not treating me with respect. That was one incident. I think there were 3 incidents that occurred during that period of time that made the base officer accused me of trying to riot, of causing a riot, me alone. And my theory was that At that point, now I'm getting ahead of myself. I was no longer an enlisted man when I'm talking about now. I had I'd gone to officer candidate school, I think, and I had become an officer. And I wasn't given any respect. So, at one point, in the course of, I was on the base, and they had offered me the right to live off the base. And I said I had no right to live off the base. I wasn't married. And I had no intention, and I was not entitled to live off the base. And in the course of my being on the base, one night, an officer came in the barracks, and he was saying to me that this is one hell of a place. And I said, he wanted to, I don't know, he wanted something from me. And I was about to get to, what the hell did he want? He was looking for he was looking for,
Hanger. He
huh?
wanted a hanger.
Yeah. He was looking for a hanger for his clothes. And I was going to give him one. And I said, oh, with it. And he said, this is one hell of a place, because he couldn't find the hanger. And I said, it certainly is. And that set him off. He stopped and started screaming, who is this nigger? And when it was dark, and he came up to me, and I saw that he was a lieutenant colonel. And he said to me, when he saw I was an officer, a second lieutenant, he said, I'm your superior by many grades. And when you are supposed to be so right, I'm your senior officer by many grades, and you are supposed to acknowledge that or something like that. And I said, you may be my senior officer by many grades, but what you have to do is learn some manners. And when you learn some manners, I will be able to respect you. But in the meantime, get the hell out of my room. And he was furious. And the next day, I saw him in the latrine, washing up, and he had on his shorts, and he was naked except for his shorts, and every part of his exposed body, when he saw me, got red as a beet, and he was he could have court-martialed me or tried to, but I think that he was afraid he could win that battle because he knew that he had been discourteous, and that was my time in the Army. The thing that was an incident that really set me off, and then let me see. I brought charges against a couple of white enlisted men because they didn't show me any respect, and the officer, the base commander, was handing me the business that he was from Vermont and so forth, but things would change in time, and that I couldn't revolutionize things right then and there. And I told him I wasn't trying to revolutionize things, but I thought that as an officer, I was entitled to respect, and I entitled to get it, or I was going to go fight in Washington. He wanted me to live off the base. I didn't want to live off the base. And so I was then very soon transferred. At one time, in the officers' club, I told you this, didn't I?
Tell the story.
Just told you.
No, you didn't tell the story.
I was in the officers' club, and it had a bar that was sort of in the back, and white officers, of course, were there. And I went up to the bar to ask them for a drink. The bartender was a black man who looked as frightened as I felt, because I had to walk sort of like a gauntlet. And I ordered a drink, and he said he didn't know what he could serve me. I said, well, why? I'm an officer. Why can't you serve me? You sound blah, 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 blah. And so he finally said that, okay, and poured me this drink. But then I couldn't pay in cash. There were chips that I had to have, and he couldn't accept the cash. One of the other white officers standing by told him to put it on his bill. I thanked him, and I finished my drink, and that ordeal was so devastating that I never tried it again. It was just too much for me. I should have gone back, but once was enough.
So, summing that up then, how did your experiences that you just told us about, how did that affect how you felt when you came out of the Army and what you did with your career? How did the Army change you? How did it draw you to the NAACP?
I had, before I went into the Army, was at Columbia, and I had these friends and so forth, and I almost had the feeling that segregation and discrimination were not really issues, because I had all these friends around and we were friendly together and did things together. And that if you worked hard and so forth, that you could beat the system and so forth. And fortunately, for my well-being, I went into the Army, and the hatred against black soldiers was so vicious and virulent that it was good, it opened my eyes, that I realized that segregation was a virulent thing, and that you had to fight it. It was good. That was a good lesson for me, because I really had almost come to the conclusion that discrimination, if you worked hard and so forth, you could live and in this country without discrimination bothering you. And then I became to understand as I went to the Army that being uneducated, you were discriminated against. Being educated didn't save you from the viciousness of discrimination. And that was a very, very good lesson for me. And when I came out of the Army, I was determined to fight segregation and to devote my life to that. And that has been my motivation for the rest of my life. The amazing thing, though, is that now the Army and the Air Force are institutions in this country that are more nearly acceptance of diversity and equal opportunity than any other institutions in the country. Mm-hmm. And that's an amazing thing. Mm-hmm. How that institution has changed. Mm-hmm. So the Air Force and the Army are now places where blacks are as able to get equal opportunity as any institution in the United States.
Do you want a break?
Huh?
Do you want a break? You want to keep going?
It's up to you.
No, it's up to you. Well, let's get you to the NAACP. How are we doing back there?
As far as time, we've recorded.
Are we through?
No.
We've recorded a half an hour on the same tape, so we can go for another 30 minutes on this tape before we need to change.
Okay, so we'll go as long as he's comfortable, and then we'll break.
Okay.
We're getting to the NAACP. Well, whenever you're tired and you want to take a break, let us know. Or hot. But the next part is how you get to the NAACP. You come out of the Army in 1944. How do you end up working in the NAACP? And you come out with this commitment.
I came out of the Army, and I really was a very country bumpkin, and I knew nothing about the NAACP's tradition. I hadn't heard of Thurgood. I hadn't heard a bit of Hasty. I was from East Orange, and the NAACP and Roy Wilkins and those people, I had never heard of them. And this was when I came out of the Army, I guess because I had gotten into trouble with, oh boy, sorry. I had gotten into trouble with, in the Army because I refused to accept segregation. And I was fighting segregation, talking about it. And some of the Army, I got in bad with the Army officials because they took me on as they thought took me on to be a snitch. I was supposed to report to the officers all the troublemakers. And the thing that was so amusing was when they found out that I wasn't, I had a liberal newspaper delivered to me and stuff, and that somehow I wasn't one of those who was gonna be snitching on the other. I was probably making trouble and complaining and stuff myself. And the officers began to cause me a lot of trouble.
Uh-oh. That's okay. Well, we kind of did the Army stuff, so you come out and you reconnect with William Hasty. Wasn't that what happened? You reconnected with William Hasty when you came out of the Army?
What about come in?
You reconnected with William Hasty when you came out of the Army. But that's not so important. We don't have to do that. I mean, you went to work for the NAACP in 1944.
I've been in work for them.
Yeah.
When I came out of when I was discharged from the Army in 44, Bill Hasty University was the dean of Howard Law School. And he told Thurgood to recruit me, that he thought I would be good on his staff. And I went on the staff, and then I got drafted.
Again.
And I had trouble with him. I told you
Yeah.
all this. So I need to go over this again. And when I settled my problems with the Army, I followed Hasty's advice and sought, even though I was now free of, I had my honorable discharge and I was free of all things. I followed his advice and sought, the war wasn't over, and sought to rejoin the Army in some capacity. And I was turned down by the Adjutant General with thanks but no thanks. And I think I wasn't a good soldier, but I think I could have been a better one if I had been allowed to be sort of have some freedom of action and not have to face all this nonsense. But it was an experience that affected my life. And I got out and decided I was going to spend my life fighting discrimination.
So what better place in the NAACP?
Yeah.
So what happened? You're hired, and what were you hired to do?
What?
What were you hired to do at the NAACP?
I was hired to at the time when the NAACP at Howard University was on a special program. And that program, we were designing cases to desegregate state institutions. And the issue was to train a cadre of black lawyers that would go into institutions back to their hometown and find and fight discrimination, bring cases and so forth and so on discrimination. And that was the program that Howard University carried on for some At first, the whole purpose of the program was to find state institutions that, and the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, that offered gains or goods or services or education for whites and not for blacks. And these lawyers on the Houston's program were to bring litigation to force whites, institutions, to either set up programs and accept blacks, or be faced with litigation. And that continued for quite a while.
What was your relationship with Thurgood Marshall? Because at this time he was heading it up. Houston had gone back to Washington.
Well, my first, when was I first with Thurgood?
1944.
My first contact with Thurgood was, I was on his staff, and I was sort of given because I had all this education, I was given a little cubbyhole to myself. And where I was supposed to be, I guess, the domestic guru. And the rest of us were, of the staff was in a big room, and I had this little cubbyhole to myself. And at one point, Thurgood, we had to get a briefing. We were on a case, the separate but equal doctrine, in Gaines. I think it was in Gaines. We were on a case
Gaines was 1938.
I had to write, I was to write a brief. No. We had to get this brief in. And now which case was that? Thurgood was out to lunch. And I was told by his secretary to do this brief, and I was very reluctant to do it because I thought that I should have been authorized. And they had long lunches and stuff. And when he got back, the brief was done. And he looked over it and sent it out. And from that time on, I began to be the guy who was doing the briefs and things like that behind the scenes. I did that for a long time, and I did not have my name on them and things like that. It didn't matter to me. But after a while, I began to feel that I should get some credit for it.
So you would, okay, all right. In addition to that, so you're really running the litigation program, writing the briefs, but you also traveled a lot as an NAACP lawyer. You visited you tried cases in every state in the South.
Yeah.
And you have a description of what that was like. Can you talk about your travels in the South and going into these courtrooms where black people would come in to watch?
Well, when we had cases at that time, they were public theaters. The first case, like Teacher Salary case, constant motley, and I tried to try that case. This was the first time they had seen a black woman lawyer in Mississippi. And the people were ecstatic because we were putting the superintendent on the hot seat. And they were reenacting our courtroom drama as we explored with these people under cross-examination, put them on the hot seat and everything like that. And they would reenact all this stuff in the barbershops and stuff with us. Constance Motley was the first black woman lawyer in Mississippi to argue a case. And now, of course, I'm sure that black women are commonplace arguing cases in Mississippi and every place else. But this was she was the first black woman they had seen. And they were just amazed that, this black woman was with her New England accent and stuff was arguing this case. And now that's commonplace.
Back there. So people would crowd into the courtrooms. African Americans would pack the courtrooms when you would go in to try a case.
Well, that was during that period of time they would. In the federal court, there was no segregation. They wouldn't allow the court. State court, there was, but the blacks were so crowded, and white people wanted to get in, but they couldn't compete with all these black folks, and so they, for the most part, they were out in the corners listening. But in the federal courts, they didn't allow that segregation, and so blacks filled up the courtroom, and these things were enacted. and Connie would tell would be asking Thurgood, or I would be asking questions, and at some point, the white superintendent would want to ask me a question, or Connie a question, and the audience would laugh. I said no. I would say no. I ask you the questions. You respond. It's not your role to ask me. You respond to questions I put. And the audience, it was precarious. The audience was so bowed down with segregation and discrimination that they precariously lived through us, this joy of being able to put the questions and put white superintendents who fostered segregation on the hot seat. So,
And then you'd hear word that they'd reenact that scene.
yeah.
You say that again? You would hear that they, what?
Mm-hmm.
You heard word that that the people in the community would reenact.
Yeah, they would reenact the stuff in their barber shops and beauty parlors and all over town. That was a very interesting era, but after a while, it was no longer the theater that it used to be.
No, it moved outside. I think we have a few more minutes on this tape. What was it like traveling in the segregated South as a young lawyer?
Well, I didn't have too much difficulty. What you did when you travel, for most part, you had no hotel facilities. After a while, you did have decent facilities, but as I recall, when I argued the Topeka case, the first of the Brown state cases, Jack Greenberg and I had to stay in a hotel. And this was an awful hotel. I told Jack that he didn't have to stay there. What he should do is stay at a decent hotel. He refused, of course. But subsequently, we began to find some decent accommodation. But at first, it was just awful to find some decent place to stay, and eventually, at times, we stayed with black friends. Hmm.
We almost at the half-hour point.
We have
Well,
10 minutes
10.
remaining on
Okay.
this tape.
Do you want to go a little bit further, or are you ready to take a rest?
How much further do we have to go?
We didn't even get to Brown yet. Okay, well, let's try one more question. We'll see how he does. How about your first case before the Supreme Court was the McLaurin case? You mentioned that earlier. Can you describe that case and what that experience was like going before them?
It was, as I remember the McLaurin case,
Actually, you described
McLaurin
it. You described it.
was, this was they called real separate but equal. McLaurin had, you couldn't say he didn't have the same facilities. He had the same facilities. He was required to sit in a special seat, and he was roped off from his classmates in a special lunch place and so forth. But he had the same books, the same professors. We argued that he was denied equal educational opportunity because he was segregated. He was not permitted to have intellectual intercourse with his fellow students. We really had a problem with some of our public about that, because some of the people felt that we were carrying it too far, that we were certain to lose, because the separate but equal doctrine was being played out before us, and they felt that the differences were too insubstantial for us to win the case. And Thurgood was very politically astute. He brought these cases and made public statements and so forth about them, and did so to not allow the people who were supporting segregation to have the day. And although each time he proved correct, the Supreme Court in our favor, the next time, the next case, they said we're going too far because the Supreme Court is too insubstantial and so forth. But he was a good publicist. He knew how to handle the cases like that, and it was really a very great time for me.
Okay, all right. Let's see how much further we can get here. In June of 1950, you talked about equalization, trying to push Plessy to its limit. But in June of 1950, the lawyers decided to attack Plessy directly. Okay. Can you talk about that shift in strategy and the significance of it?
Well, it was really a sort of a half shift, because we told our people that we were going to take only cases that we were going to attack segregation per se as being unconstitutional, and that we're not going to concentrate on unequal facilities. Although we did, as a backup, to show unequal facilities. But our main thrust was that segregation per se was unconstitutional, because our theory was that the state could equalize or try to equalize the facilities or close the gap, and they might win. So we had to argue that segregation per se was unconstitutional. At the same time, we also argued that about unequal facilities. So we didn't really give up the unequal facilities argument. That was a fallback on plan.
But here's where your role is so important about what were you going to use, bring in social science and Kenneth Clark. Can you talk about your role in the development of strategies for challenging Plessy? For challenging segregation in the schools. How are you going to make the case that separate could not be equal?
Well, the first step was Charles Houston's thesis was to bring all these cases and make them too expensive for the states to maintain. And the theory was that they would then have to allow blacks into white institutions. And if they did that at the graduate and college level, then it would be clear that nothing untoward happened. It would be clear that segregation could be maintained peacefully, and there wouldn't be riots and all that sort of stuff. So that was what we first began doing. And then when we came to, that was at the high school and so forth level. When it came to the grade schools, we didn't have the luxury of faculty to rely on. We didn't have the luxury of the exclusiveness of alumni. We didn't have all those things we had in the graduate schools and in Sweat and so forth. All the schools were presumably one like the other. There may have been some specialized grammar schools, but for the most part, they were supposed to be all the same. And this was when Brown versus the board came up, and we had to argue that segregation per se was unconstitutional, that it impaired the ability of black children to learn. And we began that.
More noise.
Oh.
I might have to kill the window. Does the sound stay the same to you? All right. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick up with that.
Well, we were preparing a case in Clarendon County desegregating the schools. And Otto Kleinberg, who was the chief social scientist at Columbia University, had the social science department at Columbia University, had made a study which showed that black migration from the segregated schools in the South to Philadelphia, then integrated, that the longer they stayed in the Philadelphia system of segregation, the higher
Of integration.
they scored on tests on all matters that measured their educational ability. We were then about to bring a case, the case seeking to attack segregation in the Clarendon County, South Carolina schools. And I went to Kleinberg and told him what we were doing and said that his study was exactly the thing we needed. I was a black man, and he, of course, was initially a little leery of getting involved because he didn't know where I was coming from. But what he did say to me, no, I'm not going to help, but he referred me to Kenneth and Mary Carr. And I hadn't heard of them or their work, and I went to them and told Kenneth what we were doing and asked him if he could help us. And at that time, they had manned Northside Center for Child Development, the only institution of its time, of its kind in Harlem, which sought to test the segregation's impact on black children. And Kenneth and Mamie had devised this doll test. And the doll test was very, very provocative, I guess the word is. They would show a doll, a black doll and a white doll, to children. The good doll, bad doll. The bad doll was always black. The good doll was always white. But the confusion was that the white doll was always them, the child who was being interviewed. And so the theory was that they thought of that was the impact of segregation and discrimination on black children, because that it impaired their ability to learn and gave them a sense of inferiority. I believe that the Clarendon County case was the only case that we used this test in presentation. We went to South Carolina and rented a house where we could work and get prepared for the trial. And one of the incidents that was very funny was that when the train left us off in Charleston, South Carolina, Kenneth was running around trying, where are my dolls? And Spotswood Robinson, who was one of our people, had not been apprised of what we were trying to do, and he was looking at me. I missed, because he thought Kenneth was coming, you know. And when he got himself together when we told him what it was all about. But I think that was the only case that we actually used the doll test itself, and tested the children and had them testify. Other times, other instances, we had sociologists talk about it and on the witness stand. What happened when Kenneth joined forces with us and became in fact almost a member of the staff, was that he was able to get professional witnesses for us to testify in various cases. And so we didn't have to rely on one or two people to become professional witnesses. We had a whole bevy of people we called on to testify as experts for us. And one of the things that I insisted on with these people was not to try to help us by testifying out of their expertise. Stay within it. Don't try to help us by testifying to things that they couldn't support. And when the academics learned that, they began to relax. And it was sort of like in the classroom. They realized that they only had to testify about what they could support and back up. And thus, they relaxed and were very good witnesses, because I said to them, you know, when you go outside your field, you are not doing us any good, because what all the lawyers try to do is, for the period of time of the cross-examination or so forth of that case, is to learn as much about your expertise and your views and how to cross-examine you and for that moment, as an expert, we try to become an expert like you. And so you don't do us any good if you don't keep within your area of expertise, because if you do, you're not helping. You're not helping us at all. When the academics learned that was what we wanted them to do, they relaxed, testified in their field, and didn't get beyond that. And so our people were able to stay well within the area of expertise. And what happened several times was that experts on the other side sought to testify outside their level of expertise. And with Kenneth's help, he was at advising me at the cross-examination, we were able to make them pay for it.
That's good. Could you say a little bit about how innovative the use of social science was in the Brown case, and how important it was to the decision?
Yeah. Well, when we came to try to use the social science data in Brown, and we got the social scientists to file a brief showing that segregation was harmful. Some of the people on our committee were very dubious because it was not hard science. And what Thurgood allowed me always to do is he allowed me to go as far as I could, as long as I could support it. And so some of our advisors didn't go for the social science stuff because they said it wasn't hard science and they didn't believe in it. And I said to them, well, I have nothing else. And if you want to offer me an alternative, fine. But if not, I'm going to take this risk. And that's how social science work got into it. And Bill Coleman, who was one of those who felt that the social science was not hard science, came to agree that it was excellent.
It was the key.
Huh?
It was the key.
Kenneth,
No, it was the key. It was the key to Brown, social science.
yeah, it was the key in the Brown case. But it was the case in Topeka that the testimony came out. The three cases that we were arguing segregation per se.
And could you state, I mean, what Brown, the opinion, the majority opinion in Brown, what it said, how it ruled in overturning segregation in the schools?
Well, Brown held that we argued, I should say, that equal educational opportunity was had never been argued in an education case, that it had been assumed by by a lot of lawyers and judges that equal education opportunity had been argued and as initially in the Supreme Court. But what we were able to show was that the court had never looked at it initially. It had assumed that other courts had initially looked at this issue ab initio, but that had not been so. And so we argued that what the court ought to do now is to look at the separate but equal doctrine and Plessy versus Ferguson as never being argued in an education case. And looking at it for the first time, find that separate but equal was unconstitutional. And that was Chief Justice Warren bought that argument and wrote the opinion that we had indicated, and that was the Brown case.
And it really is based on the social science. They grounded their
Yeah.
opinion.
This was the first use of social science, and we had a social science people writing a brief in support of the issue that segregation per se was unconstitutional. So,
What was your expectation when the court ruled unanimously in Brown?
well,
What would happen?
I came to the conclusion that the court argued that the court reached unanimously in Brown 1 on the thesis that it would be unanimous, but the implementation would be, as they said, with all deliberate speed, whatever that meant. And the implementation meant that segregation was, like in Topeka, the first case, that the Topeka school did not want, they didn't want to argue the case. They wanted to get out of it. They were ready to concede. And the Supreme Court, I wanted the Supreme Court to hold in Topeka that segregation per se was unconstitutional, but since they decided that they weren't going to meet that test, the court said it was moot and didn't reach the issue. And I proved correct because when the all deliberate speed came out, it took some 10 or 20 years before Topeka again reached the point that it was willing or ready for desegregation. When the all deliberate speed issue came, then the Topeka case continued, and the woman or the kid or the child who had brought the case initially, and the city or the state did not want to hold a moot, and the Supreme Court did, and some 20 years later, we were still fighting that case until I think they have held more recently, or tried to hold more recently, that the time for all deliberate speed had run out.
Throughout the South, you had massive resistance in response to Brown. And you really didn't have meaningful school desegregation anywhere in the South until after 1968. Really, the 1970, 71. So what is the significance of Brown? Is it just about schools? How do you see the significance of the Brown decision in 54?
100 what?
The significance of the Brown decision.
Well, the significance of Brown was its holding that segregation was unconstitutional. And it had significance because after a long period of time, when it had sort of run out and the all deliberate speed business was gone, that we had to hold that segregation itself was illegal. And the state finally came to that path. But the problem was that if it had held that without all deliberate speed indication, we would have been long gone. The all deliberate speed business delayed and delayed and delayed because nobody knew what all deliberate speed meant. Or what it meant apparently was that you could just delay implementation of Brown, of the decision. And the significance to me of Brown was that segregation was per se unconstitutional, that enforced segregation by law is no longer viable in this country. And although we still have segregation, it is segregation that people are accepting, but that it is not enforced by law. And I think that at some point, as the time is going to come when there's going to be this public, at least I hope so, this public forum to end sort of voluntary segregation, which the country is engaged in at the present time. We don't have segregation by law anymore, but people are still segregated and keep themselves segregated, and we don't have a public urge to end it. So that is going to, the beauty of the present is that at some point there's going to be this public push to end segregation. And since there's no law to enforce it, that with the voluntary segregation, I'm hoping, is going to reach a point where it will not be viable.
So, okay. A few more points to cover with the important role you play beyond Brown, in addition to working for enforcement, is that in the South, the backlash to Brown, trying to shut down the NAACP, trying to outlaw the NAACP. You were able to draw on the work you did at Columbia to fight that. And do you want to talk a
Well,
bit about that First Amendment?
The problem was that when Brown was decided, there was a backlash against the NAACP. We had not been bothered because the Southerners didn't feel we were worth bothering with, you know, NAACP. But when the Brown case was decided, they went after us on the thesis that if they could outlaw the association, that would end the problem for them. And so I had to spend a lot of time fighting to keep the NAACP alive in litigation because we're being attacked in various states. They try to outlaw us, try to do this and that, and call us unconstitutional, and so forth and so on. So I had a jurisprudence protecting and fighting for the NAACP's life, because Southerners felt that if they outlaw the association, that would end the problem. They didn't realize that the association was not the issue, that the people were concerned with it, and outlawing the association, they'd have to outlaw other folks who, under some other name, would be fighting to end segregation. University, Alabama versus the NAACP, one of the cases in the Supreme Court, which sought to hold that the NAACP was the whole of the NAACP right to fight segregation as being unconstitutional. And we had to bring cases to show that we had the right to seek equal educational opportunities, free of state coercion. And that was
And you won.
yeah, we won that case.
And that was important for all civil rights organizations.
Big
That
part.
was important for the rights of all civil rights organizations to function.
That was a very important case.
And then NAACP versus Button.
And AC versus Button, another very important case, which sought to hold that the NAACP, outlaw the NAACP, and we were able, the court held that we had a right to join together in the association to peacefully seek equal education opportunities, free. That was our First Amendment right.
Okay, one final major point that I think is important is your decision. You become general counsel of the NAACP in 1955, and you make a decision to turn attention to the North and to the problem of school segregation in the North. Could you say a bit about why you did that and how you attempted to apply Brown beyond the South?
Well, let me see how I can say, how I can get this to this. I had a problem with Jack Greenberg, and I had a problem. Jack, when Thurgood left, Jack wanted to take Thurgood's place and be the head man, and reduce me to the role of counsel. While he ran took over Thurgood's role, and my role was to just be counsel for the NAACP, with no right to bring the segregation cases and so forth. And he tried to get Roy to bar me from bringing segregation cases, that they all should come to him as head of the Legal Defense Fund. And we had a very, very public fight about that. He sought to get Roy to have me turn over to him all the segregation cases. And I was very bitter with him because in the beginning, he had been so helpful. With me on segregation cases. And then when Thurgood left to go on the Court of Appeals, he thought that as counsel for Thurgood's successor, that he could have Roy bar me from bringing any desegregation cases, and they all were supposed to belong to him. The problem with that was that I had all the segregation cases. I had them in my hands, and I was certainly not going to turn them over to him. He thought he could get Roy to do that, to force me to that. And Roy was Roy was not willing to have a public fight. And he knew that if he tried to accept Jack's plan, that there was going to be hell to pay. And that's how Jack Greenberg and I had our problem with one another, which now I left the association because they fired Louis Steele, who was a member of my staff, without notice to me, without consulting me, because he had written an article, and the article came out, unfortunately, on a day that the NAACP board was meeting, and his title was 9 Men and Black Think White. And I was told that Thurgood was on the court at the time, and he was furious. And as a result of that article, they fired Louis. And I threatened, and my whole staff threatened to resign if they didn't reinstate him. Fortunately, Roy was in Paris and wasn't able to fudge the stuff. So it all came out, and the ACLU, and I was resigning, and I got a hero, because here I'm a black man with a pretty good job, and I'm resigning my job because they fired a white man. The opposite of the stereotype. And so at that point, I was sort of tired. I didn't know where I was going with school segregation, because I thought I had exhausted all the avenues. But when I threatened to resign if they didn't reinstate Louis, I began to get revitalization, because I thought for the wrong reason, because here I'm black and I'm resigning a pretty good job because a white man has been mistreated. So that gave me a new lease on life. I put, it probably helped me get a judgeship too, I think. Because I don't know how I was first come up to be a judge when Thurgood, in the Kennedy era, Thurgood wanted to a judgeship. And they were ready to give him one, but only at the district level. And he wanted something bigger than that. And the Kennedys didn't, at that time, feel that blacks this was too big a job for a black man. And so they came after me. And I had these people that wanted me to get a judgeship. And Adam Clayton Powell and I had a sort of a conversation, and he indicated to me that I had to pay, if I paid a certain amount of money for the judgeship, I could get it. So I told my advisors this, and all hell broke loose because they felt there was a big to-do and stuff like that. It ended up with my people have to back down because of the politics of the issue. And I always say that I was responsible from Thurgood getting his Court of Appeals appointment, because all the hullabaloo about that was caused by my people that Powell had asked me for money, or indicated I could have money. In the end, it was politics. He had the votes, and so I was abandoned, and they ended up with Thurgood getting it. And I thought at that point that my chance of getting a judgeship had ended. But several years later, it came to pass.
Okay, before I finish up, I just want to go back one more time on the school piece, because when you left in 1968, when you left the NAACP, you were involved in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville case, in the Harlem 201 case. And I think your fight for quality education for black children is sort of was beyond Brown. You tried to look to the north and deal with the problems with segregated and unequal schools in the north. So maybe if you would want to reflect on that, on the state of education today, what's happened, what hasn't happened, but your efforts in the north were really pioneering.
The northern schools, what I discovered about the north was that the issue of segregation was not north-south, it was nationwide. And the northern schools didn't want integration. They wanted to keep their schools segregated, and they were gerrymandered them in instances. But the northern school segregation is that the northern issue of segregation is no different than the South. The issue of keeping blacks and whites separate is a national phenomenon. And there has been no push recently to move. And I expect that at some point there is going to be an issue of dismantling voluntary school segregation. I don't know, but right now nobody's doing anything publicly. The issue is dormant, but I'm hoping that at some point there's going to be a push for someone to end voluntary segregation, to make it more of a public issue again. But so far, nothing.
One last question, then we'll do our filling in. In the light of your history and your long struggle in the civil rights movement, how do you see the significance of Obama's election related to your history and to the struggles you've been involved in?
Well, there have been several things that have happened with Obama that were unexpected. And the passage of one of the bills for equal education, one of the bills that Obama managed to get through came as a shock and surprise.
But just the actual election of Obama, we were all here that night. Just his election, how did that make you feel in terms of your work to break down barriers, to get voting rights in the South, nationally? Any thoughts on that? Just that moment.
Well, I think that his election was certainly supportive of what I had hoped to achieve. But my story and what I hoped to achieve was not the election of a black president. I wanted to still achieve equal educational opportunities, in fact, for the poor, for blacks, and so that everybody had a chance at equal educational opportunities. Because I think that that's the key to finding black equality and diversity. For me, the level is if everybody was able to secure equal education opportunity, it would be so. Now, that may be an elitist view, I don't know. But that's how I look upon it. And I am now too old to pursue it because I'm not one of those people, or try not to be, who wants to stay on the stage long after I've been useful. I think that I've had my time, and that younger people ought to come after me, and there are a number of them who I think are going to take or taken over. So I don't have any sense of trying to keep these folks. I encourage them to come on because I'm sort of mentally fatigued, and sometimes I have I do a little writing and stuff like that, but I really haven't done anything of any substance for a period of time. I may get stimulated to do something, but I don't know. My feeling is maybe.
Well, you've done this.
But I think I chafe at vegetation, and sometimes I get weary of it. But I am not one to go back. If I get stimulated, maybe I'll do some writing and stuff, but I don't know. Okay.
Well, let's take a break and see what Floor has for us to fill in. So can we stop for a minute?
Okay. All right. Speed, camera's rolling.
Ready?
Yes.
George McLaren, I think his name was George.
No, yeah, George McLaurin.
May
Let's
applied.
Start again. Start
Huh?
from the beginning. George.
George McLaren applied to the University of Oklahoma Graduate School, and I was given what many of the public felt was the epitome of a separate but equal, because he was taught by the same faculty in the same class. All he had was a separate seat in the lunchroom and the classroom. And that was thought to be the classic separate but equal doctrine of success. But it proved vulnerable.
Great.
Ooh.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.